The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, carried into the dusty town of Caldwell, Kansas by a postal rider with a sweat-soaked hat and tired eyes. And when it landed on the wrong doorstep, it changed two lives in ways neither of them could have ever anticipated or prepared for. Bernard Hartwell found it wedged beneath the boot scraper outside his small rented room at the edge of the Caldwell boarding house, half buried in the red Kansas dirt, as though the earth itself had been trying to hold on to it. He picked it up the way a man picks up something delicate and foreign to him, turning it over in his calloused hands, reading the address with the slow, laborious effort of a man who had never been formally schooled. The envelope was addressed to a Miss Lydia Merritt, care of the Caldwell postal station, but someone had scrawled a forwarding note beneath it in blue ink that led to the room directly above his own, a room that had been vacant for 3 weeks since old Mrs. Pratchett had moved to live with her daughter in Wichita. Bernard stood in the morning light for a long moment, his thumb pressing gently against the sealed edge of the envelope. He was 27 years old, broad across the shoulders from 15 years of ranch work, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when the humidity rose, and hands that had roped cattle, mended fences, and pulled calves into the world on cold January mornings. He had never received a letter in his life. He had never written one either. Reading, for him, was a slow and painstaking exercise, something he did only when absolutely necessary, squinting at cattle brand registries and bill of sale documents with the concentrated effort of a man swimming upstream. He carried the letter inside and set it on his small table beside the water pitcher and the tin cup he used every morning, and he looked at it while he drank his coffee, and he thought about the name written on the front, Lydia Merritt. It was a name that sounded like something soft and green, like the first good pasture after a long winter drive. He did not know anyone by that name. He had never heard it spoken in Caldwell, and he knew most of the names in Caldwell by now, having lived in the town or on the ranches surrounding it for 4 years. He brought the letter to the postal station that afternoon, setting it on the counter in front of Mr. Amos Fitch, who ran the post and also sold tobacco and occasionally arbitrated disputes between neighbors. "Found this under my door scraper," Bernard said. "It ain't mine. It is not mine," he corrected himself carefully because he had been trying harder lately to speak more cleanly. "The woman it belongs to, the forwarding note puts her in Pratchett's old room, but the room is empty." Amos Fitch took the letter and examined it over his spectacles. "Lydia Merritt," he read aloud. "Well, I know that name. She's coming from Missouri. Her family's got some connection to the Holloway Ranch out east of town. I believe she's expected sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks. She wrote ahead to have her correspondence held." "There's already correspondence then," Bernard said. "This makes the 3rd piece she's got waiting," Amos said, setting it in a pigeonhole behind him. "She's a letter writer, this one." Bernard nodded and went back to the ranch where he worked, a middling spread owned by a man named Calhoun who raised beef cattle and kept 6 hands on through the spring and summer seasons. He thought about the letters in the pigeonhole, and then he stopped thinking about them, because there were cattle to move and fence posts that had rotted through the winter and needed replacing, and the world of Lydia Merritt and her correspondence had nothing to do with him. She arrived on a Thursday, coming in on the afternoon stage from Wichita with a traveling trunk, a smaller valise, and a hat that had once been very fine but had been somewhat flattened by the journey. Bernard happened to be in town that afternoon, because Calhoun had sent him to pick up a spool of barbed wire from the hardware store, and he was loading it into the wagon when the stage rolled in across the street. He noticed her the way a man notices something that does not quite fit the familiar landscape of a place he knows well. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath the flattened hat, and she wore a green traveling dress that was dusty from the road. She climbed down from the stage with careful dignity, accepting the driver's hand briefly, and then immediately looking around the street of Caldwell with an expression that was hard to read, something between determination and the barely concealed uncertainty of a person arriving somewhere entirely new. She was not beautiful in a soft or delicate way. She was striking, Bernard thought. Her face had a quality of alertness to it, as though she was always paying close attention, always processing the information the world gave her. She had strong features and dark eyes that moved quickly across the storefronts in the dusty street and the hitching rails lined with horses, and she did not flinch at any of it. Bernard loaded the last of the wire and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and he drove back to the Calhoun ranch, and he did not think about her for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about her that evening, though, sitting on the narrow porch outside his boarding house room, watching the sky go from orange to purple over the flat Kansas plain. He could not entirely explain why. He was not a man given to romantic fancy. He had courted a woman once briefly, when he was 23, a girl named Addie from a neighboring ranch, but it had come to nothing because Addie had married a shopkeeper from Dodge City who could offer her a proper house and the kind of steady life that a drifting ranch hand never could. Bernard had not mourned it particularly. He was a practical man. He knew his limitations. But there had been something about the way Lydia Merritt had stood in the street of Caldwell, dusty, and clearly exhausted from the journey, and had still looked as though she was prepared to face whatever the town decided to offer her. It had struck something in him he could not easily name. He learned more about her in the days that followed, because small towns are small, and news moves through them like water through dry ground. She was 24 years old. She had come from a town called Hannibal in Missouri, where her father had recently died of a fever, leaving her with very little. She had a cousin married to one of the Holloway hands, and it was through this cousin that she had arranged to come to Caldwell, where she would work as a seamstress, for she had some skill with a needle and thread, and the town's only other seamstress, a Mrs. Dunham, was growing too old for the finer work. She set up her small operation in the front room of the upstairs room at the boarding house, the same room that had been Mrs. Pratchett's, the room above Bernard's own. He could hear her in the mornings, the scrape of a chair, the occasional soft rhythm of something he could not identify until he finally understood it was her foot working the treadle of a small sewing machine she had brought with her in the traveling trunk. They met formally for the first time 9 days after her arrival, in the narrow hallway outside their respective rooms. Bernard was coming up the stairs with a bucket of water and Lydia was coming out of her room with a basket of finished work, and they met squarely in the middle of the hallway in a collision that was not quite a collision, both of them stopping just short. "Pardon me," she said immediately. Her voice was lower than he had expected, warm and direct. "I was not looking where I was going." "Neither was I," Bernard said, which was not true. He had been looking. He simply had not expected anyone to be coming out of that door in that moment. "You are Miss Merritt. I am Bernard Hartwell. I have the room below yours." She shifted the basket to her other arm and looked at him with those quick, attentive eyes. "The man who found my letter," she said. He was surprised. "Amos Fitch told you." "He did. I want to thank you for bringing it in. I had been worried it might be lost. That letter was from an old friend in Missouri, and I was very much looking forward to reading it." She paused. "She writes beautifully, my friend. Her letters always feel like sitting with her in the same room." "That is a fine thing," Bernard said carefully. Lydia Merritt smiled at him, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached the eyes and changed the whole landscape of a face. "It is. Are you one of the ranch hands?" "I work for Calhoun's spread east of town." "Is it good work?" No one had ever asked him that. People in Caldwell asked what outfit you worked for, how many head the ranch was running, whether the grass was coming in well. No one asked if the work was good. "It is honest work," he said after a moment. "I would not choose another kind." "That is a good answer," she said, and then she moved past him with the basket, and he stood in the hallway listening to her footsteps on the stairs, and he understood that he was in some manner of trouble. She went to the post office the next morning and collected her waiting letters, 3 of them, which she carried back to her room and read at the small table by the window. Bernard knew this because he was in the yard below when she came back, and he saw her face when she sat down with the first one, the way it softened and opened, the way she pressed one hand flat against the page as she read it. He looked away quickly, feeling that he had seen something private. In the weeks that followed, they exchanged the small, careful courtesies of 2 people who share a boarding house and have no particular reason to speak but do so anyway, because the proximity makes avoidance feel foolish. He held the front door when she had her hands full. She left a wedge of dried apple cake on his doorstep one morning with no explanation. He nodded thanks when he saw her on the stairs. She asked once, with genuine interest, about a bad cut on his forearm from a strand of barbed wire, and he explained how it had happened, and she listened with the same quality of full attention she seemed to bring to everything. He began to look forward to seeing her. He recognized this for what it was and did not fight it, because fighting it seemed like working against something inevitable. Instead, he accepted it quietly, the way a man accepts that he is thirsty before he goes to find water. What he did not do, for several weeks, was allow himself to imagine that she might think of him in any similar way. She was educated. She read and wrote letters with an ease and pleasure that he could only observe from the outside. She had come from a family that had, before circumstances reduced them, maintained a certain standing. He could read herd brands and bill of sale figures and the occasional headline of the weekly newspaper. He could write his own name and a few other necessary words, but it was slow and ugly work, letters that did not always cooperate, spelling that was unreliable at best. He was a cowboy. He had always been a cowboy and had never expected to be anything else. The understanding of what this meant hit him on a Wednesday evening in late June of 1878, when he came home from the ranch to find Lydia sitting on the small bench outside the boarding house front door, writing a letter. She wrote quickly and easily, the pen moving in long, confident strokes across the page, pausing occasionally while she thought, and then continuing. Her face had that absorbed, private expression that he had come to associate with her deepest concentration. The evening light was gold and long across the Kansas plain, and she was entirely beautiful in it, and Bernard Hartwell stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment before he went inside. He lay on his narrow bed that night and he thought about what it would mean to know her, truly know her, the way she seemed to know the people she wrote letters to and received letters from. Her world moved through words on paper. His world moved through the physical, the tangible, the immediate. And he thought that if he were ever to tell her what he felt, or if she were ever to ask him to put anything of himself into a letter, he would not be able to do it. He could not give her what she valued most. He could not speak to her in the language she used most fluently. It was that thought, lying in the dark of his small room with the stars pressing white against the window, that made him decide. He was going to learn to write, properly, all of it, not just his name and a few words, not just enough to sign a bill of sale. He was going to learn to write the way a man who wanted to be worth knowing would learn to write, because he had decided in that quiet, certain way of his that he was not going to let the gap between them be one he had chosen to leave open. The question was how. Caldwell had no school for adults. It had a small schoolhouse at the north end of town, run by a young teacher named Mr. Preston Walsh, a thin man from Ohio who had come west 2 years ago and seemed slightly baffled by Kansas in the way that some Eastern men always were, as though they had expected something from the frontier that it kept failing to deliver. Bernard went to see him on a Saturday morning, hat in hand, standing in the empty schoolroom with its rows of small desks and the long blackboard at the front wall. Preston Walsh was there grading papers when Bernard came in, and he looked up with surprise and then straightened quickly as though he expected trouble. "I need to learn to write," Bernard said without preamble. "Not to read better. I can read well enough to get by. I mean to write clearly. Letters the kind a person would want to receive. I know I should have learned when I was younger, but I did not, and now I am asking." Preston Walsh studied him for a moment. He was a fair-minded young man, it turned out, and whatever surprise he felt he put aside efficiently. "I can work with you Saturday afternoons," he said, "and possibly 2 evenings during the week if you can manage it after your ranch work. It will take some time. I want to be honest with you about that. Writing well is a practice like any other skill. It does not come quickly." "I am not asking for quickly," Bernard said. "I am asking for thorough." Preston Walsh extended his hand. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Hartwell." They began the following Saturday. It was humbling in a way that Bernard had not entirely prepared for. He sat at a desk that was built for a child. His knees pressed against the underside, and he gripped a pencil, and he practiced forming letters with the careful, embarrassed concentration of a grown man doing something he knew any 8-year-old in the county could do better. Preston Walsh was patient and did not make him feel worse about it than he already did, which Bernard noted and appreciated without saying so. The letters came slowly. His hands were built for ropes and reins and the handles of tools, not for the fine control of a pencil, and in those early weeks the letters he produced looked like something a fence post might leave in the mud. But he came back every Saturday. He came back on Tuesday and Thursday evenings too, after the ride in from Calhoun's ranch, when he was tired and his hands were sore, and he sat in the little schoolroom and practiced. He said nothing to Lydia about any of it. She, for her part, was building her small seamstress business with quiet, steady competence. The women of Caldwell found her skilled and reliable, and word spread the way it does in small places. By July, she had enough regular work to pay her rent and begin putting a small amount aside. She had made herself a part of the town in the way that certain people do, not through loud sociability, but through a kind of genuine, consistent interest in the people around her. She remembered things. She asked after Mrs. Calhoun's bad knee. She inquired about the Holloways' new foal. She noticed when the pharmacist's wife was having a difficult week and left a small gift of ribbon on the counter when she came in for thread. Bernard watched all of this from a comfortable proximity, learning her the way he had learned to read cattle, by patient, attentive observation over time. He knew that she wrote letters every Sunday afternoon, long ones to her friend in Missouri and shorter notes to a few other people. He knew that she received letters approximately twice a month, and that she read each one multiple times before she set it aside. He knew that she had a habit of humming very softly to herself when she was working on something intricate, and that she took her coffee without sugar, and that she was afraid of nothing in particular except the dark uncertainty of her own future. He knew the last thing because she had told him so, one evening on the boarding house porch in late July, when the heat was finally beginning to ease and they had fallen into the easy habit of sitting outside together in the cooling air after supper. They had begun talking more, the two of them, in those porch evenings. Not about anything urgent or important at first, but gradually, as summer deepened, the conversations had grown longer and more real. "I do not lie awake over spiders or storms," she said that evening, and there was a rueful note in her voice, as though she were confessing something. "But I lie awake over not knowing what comes next. Whether I will have enough work through the winter, whether Caldwell will grow or shrink, whether I have made the right choice coming here." "And what do you conclude when you have lain awake over it?" Bernard asked. She turned her head and looked at him, and the lamplight from inside the window caught the side of her face. "I conclude that I do not know," she said. "But that not knowing is not the same as things going wrong. I suppose I am still learning to trust the difference." Bernard was quiet for a moment, thinking about that with the serious attention he gave to most things. "I think that is wisdom," he said finally. She laughed softly. "Or stubbornness. I find those are often the same." She looked at him again, and something in her expression shifted, became a fraction more careful and intentional. "You are not what I expected, Bernard," she said, and she used his given name for the first time, and it landed on him the way the first real warmth of spring lands, sudden and unmistakable and welcome. "What did you expect?" he asked. I am not sure exactly, she said honestly. A quieter man. Most of the men I have met since coming here have been either very loud or very silent. You are neither. I talk when I have something to say, he said. Yes, she said. That is exactly it. They sat together until the stars were well established overhead, talking about smaller things after that, about a trail herd that had come through town that week, and the trouble it had caused with the local merchants, about the possibility of rain that Calhoun's foreman had been predicting. But Bernard carried the warmth of that conversation all the way to bed, and it was still there in the morning, settled in his chest like something good and permanent. He was 6 weeks into his lessons with Preston Walsh by mid-August, and the progress was real though still slow. He could form all the letters clearly now. His sentences were improving. Preston had begun working with him not just on penmanship, but on the construction of thoughts, how to take something in your mind and put it on paper in a way that came through to another person with all its shape and feeling intact. Writing a letter is an act of translation, Preston told him one Tuesday evening. You have a feeling or a thought, and you are translating it from the inside of your own head into something someone else can receive. The more clearly you see the thing you want to say, the more clearly you can write it. Bernard thought about that for a long time. He thought about what he would want to say to Lydia Merritt if he ever wrote her a letter, and the thought of it was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. He had not told Preston who he was learning to write for. He had not told anyone. He kept it as private as a man can keep something in a small town, which meant that Amos Fitch probably suspected something, and the woman who ran the boarding house definitely did not know, and Calhoun's foreman had once caught him practicing letters in the dirt with a stick during a lunch break, and had stared at him with an expression of pure puzzlement before walking away without comment. In September, 2 things happened that altered the course of everything. The first was that Lydia received a letter that disturbed her greatly. Bernard was on the porch when she came down from collecting her mail, and he saw immediately that she had been crying, though she had dried her face and composed herself before he could have said anything. She sat down beside him and held the letter in both hands and did not speak for a moment. "Bad news?" he asked. "My friend Clara," she said. "The one in Missouri who writes to me. She is very ill. They do not know what is wrong exactly, but she has been in her bed for 2 months and the doctor is not encouraged." She pressed her lips together. "Clara and I grew up together. She was the first real friend I ever had in my life. I taught her to sew and she taught me to bake bread properly, and we used to read to each other on the porch in the summers. She is the person I write to every Sunday." "I am sorry," Bernard said. He meant it with the full weight of the words, not as a pleasantry. "I have written back, of course," Lydia said. "I wrote to her last night, but it is not enough." Letters feel very small when someone you love is sick and you are 500 miles away. She looked down at the letter in her hands. "I hate the distance of it. What does the letter say?" Bernard asked, and then immediately felt the question was too familiar, too presumptuous. "I am sorry, you do not need to share it." But she looked at him directly and said, "She says she has been rereading all my old letters. She says they help. She said reading my letters is the next best thing to having me in the room with her." Lydia's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "That made me feel both better and worse at the same time." "Better because they help," Bernard said. "Worse because she needs them at all." "Yes," she said with a soft, surprised sound, as though he had put into words something she had not quite articulated for herself. "Yes, that is exactly it." They sat together for a long while after that, and Lydia talked about Clara, about their friendship, about growing up in Hannibal with the Mississippi wide and brown beyond the town. And Bernard listened with all of himself and asked questions that were simple but thoughtful. And by the time the evening cooled and the crickets were loud in the dry grass, Lydia Merritt looked lighter than she had when she came down the stairs. "Thank you," she said when she stood to go in. "For what?" "For listening," she said. "Most people listen until they feel they have been polite enough, and then they tell you what you should do or feel. You just listened." "I did not know what else to give you," he said honestly. She looked at him for a moment, standing in the lamplight from the doorway. "It was the right thing," she said quietly, and went inside. The second thing that happened in September was that Calhoun offered Bernard a more senior role on the ranch, effectively making him the second in command under the foreman, a man named Garrett who was good with cattle but poor at the organizational side of things, and increasingly happy to hand the paperwork and record-keeping to someone else. This meant a significant increase in Bernard's wages, and also the small but real possibility of a different kind of future than the one he had been looking at. He took the position. He also told Calhoun carefully that he would need to do some of the record-keeping work from town during his off days because his reading was slow and he wanted more time to do it properly. Calhoun, who was primarily interested in the cattle and trusted Bernard's honesty, agreed without much discussion. Bernard began spending more time on the ledgers and the brand records that Garrett had kept in a state of cheerful disorder, and this gave him additional practice in the written word every week beyond his lessons with Preston Walsh, and the progress accelerated. By October, his handwriting had become consistently legible, his sentence structures were improving, and Preston had started reading him passages from books and newspapers and asking him to write responses to them, summaries, reactions, opinions, the exercise of turning a thought into a paragraph. "You are learning faster than you think," Preston told him one evening. "You have a strong interior life. That helps enormously with writing. The difficulty most people have is not forming letters but having something real to say. You have something real to say. You simply needed the tool to say it with." Bernard went home that night and lay on his bed and thought about letters. He thought about the way Lydia had described Clara's letters feeling like sitting in the same room with her. He thought about what it might mean to write something for Lydia that had that quality, that felt like himself on the page, real and present and genuine. He did not write it that night. He was not ready, but he began to feel that he was moving toward readiness the way a man on a long trail moves toward the horizon, steadily and with growing certainty. Through the autumn, they grew closer. The evening porch conversations had become a reliable and cherished part of both their days, though neither had said so explicitly. They had begun taking occasional Sunday afternoon walks together along the edge of town, where the Kansas plain opened up and the sky went vast and the light in late October was extraordinary, low and golden and unsparing. On these walks they talked about everything, about Lydia's work, about the ranch, about the nature of Kansas and how different it was from Missouri and Ohio respectively, about books she had read and he had not, and she began describing them to him with an enthusiasm that was completely charming, her hands moving as she talked, her face animated. He loved that about her. He loved the way her mind moved, the way she was not afraid of any idea, the way she would follow a thought wherever it went with genuine curiosity. He loved that she laughed easily and meant it, and that she did not suffer pretension in herself or others. He loved that she treated everyone she met, the boarding house owner, the stable boy, the Cheyenne woman who sometimes camped at the edge of town with her family when they came in to trade, with the same consistent, unhurried courtesy. He had not yet told her any of this. He was building toward it the way he had been building toward the writing, steadily, and on a foundation he wanted to be solid before he asked it to bear weight. She told him in November that Clara was improving. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning and she was down the stairs and out the front door quickly, and she nearly walked into him on the porch, and she caught his arm to steady herself and said, "Clara is better. She is out of her bed. She walked to the window yesterday and looked at the river." The relief on her face was radiant. It was the most openly joyful he had ever seen her, and Bernard felt something unlock in his own chest in response to it, as though her happiness had the capacity to move through him as well. "That is wonderful," he said. "I have to write to her tonight," Lydia said. "I have to tell her how glad I am. I do not even know how I will find the right words." "You always find the right words," Bernard said. She looked at him. "How would you know?" He paused, realizing he had said something that revealed more than he intended. Clara told you that your letters help her, he said carefully. That suggests you find the right words. Oh, she said. Yes, and she looked at him with something thoughtful in her expression, something he could not quite read. I suppose that is true. She went inside to write her letter, and Bernard sat on the porch in the November cold and thought about the fact that he was very much in love with this woman, had been for some time, and that he needed to do something about it. He finished his letter on a cold Thursday night in late November, by the light of the oil lamp at his small table, and it took him 3 hours and 2 complete drafts before he had it right. His hand ached. His third draft was not perfect, but it was honest, and it was clear, and it was his, and he read it back to himself 3 times before he was satisfied that it said what he meant it to say. Preston Walsh had read an early version and had made only a few small suggestions, and had then looked at Bernard with an expression that was both professional and deeply human, and had said, "This is a fine letter, Bernard. Anyone would be glad to receive it." He slid the letter under Lydia Merritt's door on a Friday morning before he left for the ranch, before she was awake, before the rest of the boarding house had stirred. He had addressed the front of the envelope in his careful, practiced hand. He had sealed it with a drop of wax, because Preston had shown him how, and because it had seemed important that it arrive with that dignity. He rode out to Calhoun's ranch in the cold, clear morning, and tried not to think about it, and largely failed. Lydia found it when she opened her door at 7:30, nearly stepping on it, and she picked it up and saw her own name written in a hand she had not seen before, clear and careful and deliberate, each letter placed with evident effort. She recognized the care in it immediately, the way a person who writes knows another person's relationship to writing by how it looks on the page. Whoever had written this had worked hard for every letter. She opened it at her table with her morning coffee beside her, and she read it. It began simply. He had told Preston he could not start with anything flowery or elaborate because that would not be him, and Preston had agreed, and so it began simply. It said, "Dear Miss Merritt, I am going to tell you something that I have not said aloud because I wanted to give it to you in the form that seems to mean the most to you. I have been learning to write since the beginning of July because I wanted to be able to do this properly. I do not mean this as a performance of effort. I mean it only as an explanation of why this letter exists at all, because before July I could not have written it, not well enough to be worth your reading. I do not know exactly when I understood that I cared for you, but I know it was early. I think it may have been the day I saw you reading your letters in the room above mine, and you pressed your hand flat against the page, and I understood that words on paper were something you held onto for real comfort. I wanted from that point forward to be a person whose words you might hold onto. I am not an educated man. I will never be a great reader or writer. But I am honest, and I am steady, and there is not one thing I have ever told you that I did not mean. I do not know if any of this is welcome or wanted. I only know that I am incapable of letting another season go by without giving you the choice. If you do not feel as I do, I will respect that entirely and remain your neighbor, and I hope your friend for as long as you will have me. But if there is any part of what I have written here that you recognize as something you might also be feeling, then I hope you will tell me. I remain, with more sincerity than I know how to properly measure, your neighbor and admirer, Bernard Hartwell. Lydia Merritt read the letter twice through, and she put it down on the table, and she picked it up again and she read it once more. The third time she read it she began to cry, not from sadness, not from any kind of grief, but from the kind of feeling that rises up when something very beautiful and very unexpected arrives in your hands, and you understand that you have not been imagining it, that it has been real all along. She thought about the months of porch evenings and Sunday walks and the easy, genuine conversations in the hallway and over the fence of the yard, and she thought about how she had gradually and completely stopped feeling alone in Caldwell. And she had not fully attributed this to Bernard specifically, but it had been Bernard entirely. His steady presence, his honest attention, his quiet and particular way of seeing the world. She thought about the careful, laborious writing on the page in her hands, and she thought about July, about how he had been going somewhere in the evenings and on Saturday afternoons. She had noticed the absence and had not known what to make of it, and now she understood what she had not known to understand. He had learned to write. For her. He had sat in a child's desk in Preston Walsh's schoolroom and practiced forming letters, for months, so that he could give her something in the form that mattered most to her. The thought of it filled her to the very brim. She was dressed and down the stairs before she fully knew what she was doing, and she was standing at the stable with the horse she sometimes rented from the stable owner for Sunday rides, and she was riding out to Calhoun's ranch on a cold Friday morning in November, and she did not care at all about the cold. She had never been to the ranch before, but everyone in Caldwell knew where Calhoun's spread was, east of town on the good pasture that ran down toward the creek. She rode the 4 miles in a brisk wind and arrived at the gate to find Garrett the foreman looking at her with understandable surprise. "I need to speak to Bernard Hartwell," she said. "Please." Garrett stared at her for a moment and then, apparently deciding that the urgency in her face was sufficient justification, turned and pointed toward the east pasture where several figures were visible working with a string of horses. "He's out with the string," Garrett said. "You can ride out." She did. Bernard saw her coming from a distance, recognized the horse and then recognized her, and his heart performed a complicated maneuver in his chest. He handed the lead line he was holding to the ranch hand next to him, and walked out to meet her as she reined in. She dismounted and faced him with the cold reddening her face and her breath misting in the air between them, and she had the letter in her hand, creased from being held. "You learned to write," she said. "For months. You have been going to Preston Walsh and learning to write. All this time." "Yes," he said. He was watching her face, trying to read it. Her eyes were reddened at the edges, and he understood she had been crying, and he could not tell yet whether it was good or not good. "This letter," she said, and held it up. "Bernard, this letter." "I meant every word of it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I rode out here." She took a step toward him. "I want to tell you something. I have been trying to write you a response in my head the whole ride out, and I keep failing to find the right words, which almost never happens to me, and I think that means I have to just say it plainly." "Please do," he said. "I care for you," she said. "I have cared for you for a long time. I thought it was just the particular quality of our conversations, of your company, but when I read your letter this morning I understood that it is not just that. I have been falling in love with you, Bernard Hartwell, since approximately August, and I have been too cautious and too uncertain to say so. And you wrote me a letter with hands that learned how just to be able to do it, and I could not stay in that room a single moment longer without coming to find you." The wind moved across the east pasture, and the horses behind Bernard stamped and breathed in the cold air, and he looked at Lydia Merritt standing in the wide Kansas morning with the letter in her hand, and he felt something settle into place inside him with a solidity and rightness that he had never experienced before. He reached out and took her free hand in both of his carefully, the way he had picked up her letter from the dirt all those months ago. "You came all the way out here," he said. "You learned to write for me," she answered simply, as though this explained everything, because it did. He was not a man who had ever said things easily without being sure of them first, but in that moment he was entirely sure. "I love you, Lydia," he said. "I have loved you since before I knew I was capable of it." She squeezed his hands, and the tears that had dried on her ride out were replaced by new ones, warm and entirely different in their quality. "I love you too," she said. "And I am going to write you the best letter you have ever received just as soon as I get back to town." He laughed, and it was the fullest laugh, the kind that comes from a place that has been opened and filled. "I will write you back," he said, "properly. I want you to know I will always write you back now." "I know," she said. "I know you will." He walked her back to her horse and helped her mount, and he stood at the edge of the east pasture and watched her ride back toward Caldwell, and the ranch hand who had taken the lead line from him earlier came to stand beside him and said nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a season that Caldwell would remember as particularly cold, with 3 significant snowstorms between December and February. But for Bernard Hartwell and Lydia Merritt, it was a winter of extraordinary warmth. They were officially courting now, which in Caldwell meant that they were seen together at church on Sunday mornings and at the monthly social at the Grange Hall, and that the boarding house owner, Mrs. Hadley, looked at them with the satisfied expression of a woman who considers herself to have facilitated something simply by providing them both with rooms. They exchanged letters throughout that winter, even living in the same building, which became a small and beloved joke between them. Bernard would slide a letter under her door on a Monday evening, and she would reply in kind by Wednesday, and they would then discuss some or all of it over supper, or on the porch if the cold was not too sharp, or standing in the hallway with their lamps in their hands. It was a way of thinking about each other, of reaching toward each other in a medium that one of them loved naturally, and the other had worked very hard to be able to inhabit. She cried reading every single letter he wrote her. This was not something she announced or made dramatic. Bernard noticed it simply because he noticed everything about her, and occasionally when they spoke about what he had written, she would have the particular quality about her eyes that he had come to recognize as recent tears. He did not say anything about it directly for a long time because it seemed private, but finally one evening in January he asked. "The letters," he said. "You cry when you read them. I have seen it." She did not look embarrassed. She looked at him with the clear directness that was one of her most essential qualities. "Yes," she said, "I do." "Because they are badly written?" he asked, with a slight upturn of tone that she recognized as his version of teasing. "Because they are so completely you," she said. "Because I can feel how much effort they take, not just the writing of them but the thinking behind them, what you choose to say and how you choose to say it. It is like reading someone's heart, Bernard. It makes me cry because it is so honest and so good and because I love you so much." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then I will keep writing them," he said. "Please," she said. "Always." He asked her father's permission, and then remembered with the quiet sadness he always felt on her behalf that her father was gone. He asked her instead, which seemed more right anyway. He asked her in March of 1879 on a Sunday afternoon walk, when the first real warmth was beginning to creep back into the Kansas air, and the grass was turning green in patches along the creek. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you are willing." "I have been waiting for you to ask," she said. "I began wondering in January whether you were going to. I wanted to be sure I could offer you something stable," he said. "Calhoun has offered me a partnership in the ranch. Not a large one, but real. It means a future with a foundation." "Bernard," she said, "I would have said yes in November if you had asked." "I know," he said, "but I wanted it to be right." She took his arm and they walked on along the creek, and the sky above the Kansas plain was enormous and blue and unbroken, and she said yes in the afternoon light with the same clear directness she had always brought to everything, and it felt like the most natural and inevitable thing in the world. They were married in May of 1879 in the small white church at the north end of Caldwell, with Preston Walsh among the guests, looking quietly pleased with himself in a way he was too professional to fully express. Clara, recovered from her illness and stronger than she had been in years, made the journey from Hannibal for the wedding, and she and Lydia embraced on the church steps for a long time, and then Clara looked at Bernard with the assessing eye of a woman who takes friendship seriously. "She has written me about you for months," Clara told him. "I hope kindly," Bernard said. "She said," Clara told him, with a small, particular smile, "that she found a man who learned to write just so he could tell her what he felt. She said she did not know what to do with a man like that except love him." Bernard felt the words land in his chest and stay there, as permanent and warm as anything he had ever held onto. The wedding supper was held at the Grange Hall with most of Caldwell in attendance, which in a town of 500 people is a substantial gathering, and Calhoun made a toast that was better than anyone expected, and Garrett drank more than was perhaps advisable but remained good-natured throughout, and Mrs. Hadley of the boarding house cried in the front row during the ceremony in a manner that suggested she had always known this was going to happen. They moved into a house that spring, a proper house on the western edge of town, not large but solidly built, with a good kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a front porch that looked out over the flat Kansas plain toward the horizon. Bernard spent 2 weeks of evenings repairing the porch boards and painting the shutters, and Lydia set up her sewing in the front room and her writing at the kitchen table, and filled the windowsills with the small practical things that make a space feel inhabited and genuine. She continued her seamstress work, which had grown steadily throughout the winter and showed no signs of slowing. Bernard had his duties at the ranch, which now included the record-keeping and organizational work that came with his partial partnership, and he was at the desk in the evenings more often than not, working through ledgers and correspondence, his handwriting by now entirely competent, still not elegant but clear and sure and his own. They wrote each other letters still, sometimes, when one of them was away. Bernard made occasional overnight trips with cattle drives that brought him as far as Wichita, and Lydia made a journey to Missouri in the summer of 1879 to spend 3 weeks with Clara. And in both cases, the letters they sent each other back and forth across the distance had all the warmth and honesty of the winter letters, all the particularity of 2 people who had made it their practice to say true things to each other. She cried reading every single one of his letters. She had told him she would, and she did. He had told her he would always write them, and he did. It was a vow they had made casually and kept scrupulously. The summer of 1879 was a good one for the ranch, warm and with enough rain to keep the grass in good order, and Calhoun was pleased with how the operation was running under Bernard's steadier management. The cattle were healthy, the records were clean, and the relationship with the neighboring ranches, which had been strained in some respects under Garrett's more confrontational approach, was improving. The town of Caldwell itself was growing. The railroad terminus was expanding, bringing more traffic and more commerce, and new families were arriving with enough frequency that Lydia's seamstress work expanded beyond what she had originally anticipated. She took on a young woman named Hannah Driscoll as an apprentice in the autumn, a 16-year-old with good hands and a willingness to learn, and the small front room became a genuine workshop. There was, in the background of those Kansas years, the weight of things that were not simple. The frontier was not a place of uncomplicated beauty and open opportunity for everyone, and Bernard and Lydia both knew this, in different ways and from different vantage points. The Cheyenne families who sometimes came through Caldwell, who had been on this land when the town was a cluster of 3 buildings, who had lost so much through the relentless push of settlement, were treated by most of the townspeople with a mixture of wariness and indifference that sat uneasily with Lydia's sense of justice. She had made a point, since arriving in Caldwell, of treating the Cheyenne traders and travelers with the same courtesy she extended to everyone, and she had been quietly appalled on more than one occasion by how unusual this made her seem. Bernard had grown up around working cattle in a world that was often brutal and unfair on many fronts, and he had developed his own sense of right and wrong in that context, not perfect but genuine. They talked about it, sometimes, on the long porch evenings, about what was owed and what had been taken, and what a person of conscience did within the limited power of one ordinary life. "We cannot fix all of it," Lydia said one evening. "But we can refuse to participate in the worst of it, and we can treat people as people." "That is what we do," Bernard said. "It is not enough," she said. "No," he said, "but it is what we have, and we do it." She leaned into his shoulder on the porch bench, as she had taken to doing in the evenings, and they sat together in the big Kansas silence and thought about the complexity of the world they were living in, and held on to each other in the specific way of two people who have found something good and intend to hold it carefully. In November of 1879, Lydia told Bernard she was expecting their first child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, with coffee between them and the early winter light coming gray through the window, and she watched his face with that attentive quality of hers, waiting to see what she would find there. What she found was something she later described to Clara in a letter as the quietest and most complete joy she had ever seen on a human face. He did not shout or pound the table or make any of the performances that some men might have made. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, the same gesture he had made in the east pasture on the day she rode out to find him, and he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "A little unsteady in the mornings," she said. "But well, I am well." "Good," he said, and he held her hand in both of his, and he looked at her with a fullness that made her eyes sting. "I will write you a letter tonight," he said. "About this?" she asked. "About this," he confirmed. "About everything." He did. He wrote her a letter that night at the kitchen table while she worked on mending at the other end, and when he finished it, he brought it to her with the particular solemnity he brought to things that mattered most. She read it then and there, and he watched her face, and she cried reading it the way she always cried reading his letters, with the full, unguarded feeling of someone who has been given something irreplaceable. "You have to stop writing them this beautifully," she said when she had wiped her eyes, "or I am going to ruin every one of them." "Keep them," he said. "Ruin them if you want. I will write you new ones." Their son was born in July of 1880, in the front bedroom of the house on the western edge of Caldwell, with the help of the town's doctor, a competent woman named Dr. Helen Marsh, who had arrived in Caldwell 2 years prior, and had been quietly revolutionary in her presence and her practice. It was a long and difficult birth, and Bernard sat outside the bedroom door in the hallway for 6 hours in a state of controlled terror, and when he finally heard the small, furious cry that meant everything was all right, he put his face in his hands and stayed that way for a long minute. They named the boy James, after Lydia's father, and he was a loud and strong and entirely healthy child who ate and slept with the same enthusiastic commitment he would later bring to everything in life. Bernard held him on the second day, sitting in the chair beside Lydia's bed, and looked at the small, indignant face pressed against his chest, and he thought about the 27-year-old man who had found a letter in the dirt outside his door, and had not imagined that 2 years later he would be sitting in his own house holding his own son. "He looks like you," Lydia said from the bed, watching them. "He looks like a potato," Bernard said, and Lydia laughed so hard she had to press a pillow to her midsection, and the baby, startled by the sound, scrunched his face in an expression of outrage. Clara came to Hannibal to meet James in August, making the long journey on the train, and she stayed 2 weeks in the guest room that Bernard had finished just in time, and the house was full of the kind of warmth that only comes when people who love each other are together in a space they have made for themselves. Clara watched Bernard with James one afternoon, when Lydia was in the front room working on a commission, and she watched Bernard holding the baby on the porch and talking to him quietly about the quality of the afternoon light and the behavior of the horses in the yard. And she thought about all the letters Lydia had written her, and understood that every word of them had been true. Before she left, Clara pulled Bernard aside in the kitchen and said, "You should know that her letters about you are the most beautiful she has ever written. She writes about you the way the best writers write about things they cannot imagine living without." "She is remarkable," Bernard said simply. "You both are," Clara said, "and you deserve each other, which is the nicest thing I know how to say about two people." The years that followed were the years of building. The ranch partnership deepened as Calhoun, who had no children of his own, grew older and relied more heavily on Bernard's management. The town of Caldwell grew and changed with the expansion of the cattle trade, and through it all the house on the western edge of town remained steady and warm and full. Hannah Driscoll, Lydia's apprentice, became fully skilled by 1882, and Lydia helped her set up her own small operation in a second room at the back of the house, the two of them working side by side in a partnership that served the growing town well. Lydia's reputation as a seamstress had by this point extended beyond Caldwell, and she occasionally received commissions by letter from women in Wichita and Dodge City, which amused her and gave her considerable satisfaction. Bernard's writing had continued to improve through all of this, steadily and without particular fanfare, the way any practiced skill improves over time. By 1882, he was keeping the ranch's full correspondence himself, writing to buyers and sellers and land agents and brand inspectors with a clarity and directness that was entirely recognizable as his voice, and Preston Walsh, who had stayed in Caldwell longer than he had expected to, told him once that he had long since surpassed what Preston had set out to teach him. "You taught yourself the most important parts," Preston said. "I only taught you the alphabet and punctuation." "You taught me that writing is translation," Bernard said. "I have thought about that every time I have sat down to write anything." He continued to write to Lydia letters when he was away, which became less frequent but never entirely disappeared. Occasionally when he was home, when something moved through him that was difficult to say aloud but needed to be said, he would write it instead and leave it on the kitchen table for her to find in the morning. She read every one with the same full, unguarded feeling she had brought to the very first, the day she had ridden out to the east pasture on a cold November morning with his letter in her hand. Their second child arrived in September of 1883, a boy they named William, who came into the world with considerably more cooperation than his older brother had, and who from his earliest weeks had his mother's particular quality of alert, attentive watchfulness, looking at the world around him as though processing and cataloging it for future reference. James, by then 3 years old and already in possession of strong opinions about most things, regarded the new arrival with a mixture of suspicion and conditional acceptance that the family found endearing. The winter of 1883 was the winter that tested them in ways they had not been tested before, because Calhoun suffered a stroke in October, and the ranch suddenly needed much more of Bernard than had been previously planned, and simultaneously Lydia's mother, who had been living with relatives in Missouri since her husband's death, took ill, and Lydia needed to go to her. They managed it the way they managed everything, together and honestly, and without pretending the difficulty was not real. Bernard arranged for a trusted hand to take over the physical management of the ranch, while he managed the financial and administrative side from Caldwell. Lydia made the journey to Missouri with baby William, leaving James in the care of Mrs. Hadley at the boarding house, who had become, in the years since their wedding, a trusted and beloved presence in their lives. Lydia was gone for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks Bernard wrote her a letter every 4 days without exception. He wrote about the ranch and the weather and James's increasingly elaborate theories about why the neighbor's dog was untrustworthy. He wrote about missing her with a directness and precision that she later told him made her feel as though he were sitting across the kitchen table from her, even in the cold Missouri winter. She wrote back just as faithfully, and her letters were everything he had always known her letters would be, full of her father's house as her mother slowly recovered in it, full of Missouri in winter and the particular quality of the Mississippi, and the way seeing Clara again for the first time in several years felt like no time had passed at all. She wrote about William learning to recognize new faces and about her own complicated emotions, the grief and love and exhaustion of caring for a parent in decline. He kept all of her letters in a cedar box that he had made himself, tongue and groove, with a small brass latch, and she kept all of his in an old hat box lined with blue paper that she had brought from Missouri in the original traveling trunk. And years later, when James was old enough to be curious about it, he would find the hat box and be told that it was private and special and not to be opened. And he would accept this with the seriousness of a child, who understands that some things are important even when he does not entirely know why. Lydia's mother recovered sufficiently to be moved to a small room in the home of reliable relatives, and Lydia returned to Caldwell in December of 1883, arriving on the afternoon stage in the kind of cold that made the air sharp as glass. And Bernard was at the stage stop with James beside him, and when Lydia climbed down from the stage with William in her arms, James launched himself at her with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who has been missing his mother for 6 weeks, and she caught him with her free arm and held both of her children, and then looked over their heads at Bernard. He was simply standing there, looking at her. His hat was in his hands, and the cold was reddening his face, and he had the expression she had catalogued over years of watching him, the one that meant he was feeling something very large and very deep, and was allowing himself to feel it fully. She handed him William, who was bundled like a small parcel against the cold, and put her free hand on Bernard's chest, and stood on her toes to kiss him in the middle of the street in front of the stage stop, and she did not care at all who was watching, because she had been 6 weeks away from him and it had been long enough. "I have a letter at home," he said against her hair, "that I wrote for you the day before you arrived. I was going to give it to you tonight." "Then give it to me tonight," she said. "You will cry," he said. "I always cry," she said. "That is not a reason not to give it to me." He laughed, and she stepped back and looked at him with all the love that had been building for 5 years and showed no signs of finding a limit. Calhoun died in the spring of 1884, peacefully and in his own house, and left the ranch in equal shares to Bernard and Garrett, with a letter that he had asked Bernard to write for him at the end, when his hands were too weak to hold a pen. Bernard had sat beside the old man's bed and written what he dictated, word by word, and had added at the bottom, with Calhoun's whispered permission, a line of his own. He was a man who trusted the right people and was repaid in full. The ranch under Bernard and Garrett's joint ownership ran even better than it had under Calhoun, because Garrett was a genuinely skilled rancher and Bernard was genuinely skilled at everything else, and they had the good sense to respect each other's competencies without ego. By 1886, the Hartwell-Garrett spread, as it came to be called, was one of the better regarded operations in that part of Kansas. James Hartwell started school in the fall of 1885 and took to reading immediately, and with an intensity that made his teacher, a young woman named Miss Pemberton, who had taken over when Preston Walsh finally returned to Ohio, write a note home to his parents saying that James read at a level well above his peers, and had asked in his first week whether there were any books about the history of cattle trails. Lydia showed the note to Bernard over the kitchen table, and he read it carefully and then set it down. "He gets the reading from you," he said. "He gets the questions from you," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and Lydia thought, not for the first time, that this was the deepest kind of happiness, not the shining, explosive kind, but the steady, pervasive kind that lived in the ordinary moments, the kitchen table and the morning coffee, and the particular expression on your person's face when they have just told you a true thing. William, at 3, was already showing the same attentive quality he had been born with, though in him it expressed itself differently, in a deep interest in the physical world, in how things worked, in the mechanics of the pump in the yard and the latch on the gate, and the way the windmill moved. He followed Bernard around the ranch with a furrowed concentration that the ranch hands found endearing and Bernard found both touching and occasionally exhausting. "He wants to understand everything," Bernard said. "He is your son," Lydia said. "He is your son too," Bernard said. "Yes," she said, "but the wanting to understand everything, that is you." The winter of 1886 was mild, which was fortunate because Lydia was expecting their 3rd child and had found the later stages of both previous pregnancies best managed in conditions that were not extreme. Their 3rd child arrived in February of 1887, a girl this time, whom they named Eleanor, which had been Lydia's mother's name, and who arrived with a degree of cheerful efficiency that the doctor said was entirely admirable. Eleanor Hartwell was, from her earliest days, a creature of distinct personality, vocal and opinionated and interested in everything. And she and James developed an early and enduring alliance based on the shared conviction that the world was full of interesting things and worth investigating vigorously. William, the middle child, watched this alliance from a position of calm, affectionate detachment, and went about his own investigations at his own pace and in his own directions. The household was full and loud and warm and occasionally chaotic, and Bernard and Lydia navigated it the way they navigated everything, side by side and honestly, and with the consistent, reliable partnership that had been the ground of their life together since the beginning. He still wrote her letters. Not as frequently as in the early years, because the conditions of their days were such that they had a great deal of time together, and there was less need to cross distance with words. But when something moved through him that he wanted to give her in the particular form that meant the most to her, he sat down at the kitchen table in the quiet of the evening, and he wrote it out, patient and careful and entirely his own, and in the morning she would find it where he had left it for her. And she would read it, and she would cry, every single time, not from sadness, but from the fullness of feeling that came from being known and loved by someone who had learned how to tell her so. She had tried to explain it to Clara once, in a letter she wrote on a January evening while Bernard was putting the children to bed, and she could hear his voice and their voices from down the hall, the occasional outbreak of laughter and the firm, kind tones of a man who was both the authority and the favorite presence in the room. She had written, "I never think of his letters as less than the finest writing I have read, and I am a person who reads widely and attentively. I know that by any technical measure there is finer writing in the world, but there is no writing in the world that carries more of itself to me than his. It is completely him on the page, as honest and steady as he is in life, and when I read it I feel that I am receiving something that most people spend their whole lives looking for and not finding. The right words, from the right person, given with the full intention of being understood. I am a person who has always believed in the power of letters. I never imagined I would end up married to a man who learned to write so that he could send me one." She sealed the letter and addressed it to Hannibal and put it in the stack for tomorrow's post. And then she went down the hall to the children's room where Bernard was finishing the story he told them every night. Always a different one, invented as he went, about cattle trails and wide plains, and the things a person could find if they rode far enough into the open country with their eyes open and their heart ready. She stood in the doorway and listened, and James was nearly asleep and William had his eyes open and was watching his father with that deep, assessing gaze of his, and Eleanor had both arms wrapped around the stuffed rabbit that Lydia had made her from a scrap of good wool, and Bernard's voice moved through the quiet room with its particular quality, low and warm and entirely present. He looked up when he sensed her in the doorway, and something in his expression lightened and completed itself, the way a room is different when the person you love most walks into it. He finished the story, a trail drive that ended with the discovery of a good creek and green pasture, and the kind of evening that makes the whole drive worth it, and tucked each child in with the particular individual attention he had always given them, the specific word for James, the specific gesture for William, the kiss on the top of Eleanor's head that made her tighten her arms around the rabbit, and then he came out into the hall and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. Clara's letter. He asked, meaning had she finished it, and she said yes, and he said good, and they walked down the hall together toward the kitchen and the remainder of the quiet evening. "Write me a letter," she said as they came into the kitchen and she put the kettle on for the last cup of the day. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she said, "or whenever, but soon." "What should I write about?" he asked, sitting at the kitchen table and looking at her with those steady, dark eyes. "Tell me something you have not told me yet," she said. He was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking about it. This was something she loved about him, that he treated the question with real seriousness. "I will think of something," he said. "You always do," she said. She set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him. And outside the window the Kansas night was enormous and dark and full of stars. The same stars that had been there in 1878 when she arrived on the stage with her flattened hat and her traveling trunk. The same stars that had been above the porch on all those evenings. And the same stars that would be there tomorrow and the day after. Constant and generous and indifferent to the small, particular, irreplaceable life being lived beneath them. "I love you," Bernard said across the table, the way he had been saying it for nearly 10 years, without excess and without qualification, and with everything he meant behind it. "I love you," she said back the same way. The kettle began to steam. The house was quiet around them. 3 children slept at the end of the hall. Outside, the ranch stretched east toward the creek and the good pasture, and the stars above it were bright and uncounted. And somewhere in a cedar box with a brass latch, there was a stack of letters tied with a piece of ribbon. And in an old hat box lined with blue paper, there was another stack. And between those 2 collections of words was the whole history of 2 people who had found each other in a dusty Kansas town and had chosen, in every way available to them, to be fully known. He wrote her the letter the next morning, before she was awake, before the children were up, in the cold gray hour before the sunrise, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the pencil moving steadily across the page. He wrote about what he had not yet told her, which was that every morning when he woke before her and heard her quiet breathing in the room, and then came out to start the lamp, he thought about the man he had been before she came. Not unhappy exactly, but incomplete in a way he had not fully understood until it was no longer true. He wrote that he thought a person spent their life not knowing what they are capable of until something calls it out of them. She had called it out of him, not just the writing, all of it, the capacity to be known and to know, to be fully in a life instead of passing through one. He folded the letter and set it where she would find it. She found it at 7:30, with her coffee, in the quiet before the children were properly awake, and she read it at the kitchen table in the winter morning light with her hand pressed flat against the page. And she cried, the way she always cried reading his letters, with the full, honest feeling of a woman who has been given something she knows the true value of. And she reached for a fresh sheet of paper and began to write him back. Outside, the Kansas morning opened wide above the plain, and the horses were moving in the yard, and somewhere east of town, the ranch was waking up to another good day of honest work under a clear sky. And in the house on the western edge of Caldwell, 2 people who had found each other by the grace of a misdirected letter and the stubbornness of a cowboy who decided to learn what he needed to learn were writing to each other across a kitchen table, and would write to each other for the rest of their lives. James grew up to be a reader and a rancher both, eventually taking a significant role in the spread, and also reading every book he could acquire, which in time became quite a number. William became an engineer, eventually, drawn west and then east by the mechanics of things, and came back to Caldwell in his 20s with a wife and a set of plans, and a deep affection for the parents who had never made him feel that his particular way of seeing the world was anything other than exactly right. Eleanor became a teacher, which surprised no one who had known her from childhood, and taught for 30 years in 3 different Kansas towns, and wrote letters to her mother every week of those 30 years, with the fluency and pleasure of someone raised in a household where letters were not a formality but a form of love. And Lydia and Bernard grew old in the house on the western edge of Caldwell, in the increasing comfort of 2 people who have spent so long in each other's company that they have become, in some fundamental way, built of each other, each one carrying the other's voice and warmth and particular way of meeting the world. They sat on the porch in the evenings as they had always done. They argued occasionally about small things and never about large ones, because the large things had been settled long ago. They had grandchildren eventually, James's first, a boy named George who arrived in 1901 and looked exactly like his grandfather, and the cedar box was handed down eventually, when Bernard and Lydia decided together that the letters in it should stay in the family. The last letter Bernard wrote Lydia was on the occasion of their 30th wedding anniversary in May of 1909. He had kept the habit all those years, the particular letters that were not for any practical purpose, but simply because something moved through him and needed to be given to her in the form that mattered. And this one he wrote at the same kitchen table on a spring evening, with the light coming long and golden through the window the same way it had come the evening she had been on the porch in 1878 writing her own letter, and he had stood at the edge of the yard and understood what it would mean to reach her. He wrote about 30 years. He wrote about what he had never expected to have and what having it had made of him. He wrote about the East pasture in November and the letter she had ridden out to find him with. He wrote about learning the alphabet in Preston Walsh's schoolroom, sitting in a child's desk with his knees pressed against the underside, and about the first letter he had ever written and how terrified he had been sliding it under her door, and about all the letters that had come after. He wrote about the cedar box and the hat box and the particular quality of a life that has been continuously said out loud between two people, so that nothing was ever left unspoken that needed saying. He wrote, "I have loved you for 30 years with everything that is in me, and the most remarkable discovery of those 30 years is that the everything does not diminish. It only grows. I began with hands that could barely form letters and a heart that was full of something I did not yet have the words for. You gave me the reason to find the words. I have been finding them ever since. I will find them as long as I am here to hold a pen." He left it on the table and went to bed, and she found it in the morning, and she read it twice, and then a third time, and she pressed her hand flat against the page the way she had always done, the way she had done with the first letter he ever wrote her and every letter after. And she cried, reading every single word.